So let's talk a little bit about the, one of the things that people have speculated about, and I think you cite some research as well in the book about the implications of the message that we're headed towards a majority minority society. That it creates essentially it supercharges white racial anxiety, I guess.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think there's convincing social psychological research on this. And, a Yale social psychologist, Jennifer Richardson, and her colleagues have really been in the lead in demonstrating that when you prompt whites with, some kind of signal about demographic change and what it might do to the white majority position, many of them, not just conservatives, many of them become anxious. They adopt more conservative political opinions. They express more racial resentment. And I think a lot of the political science that has analyzed the outcome of the 2016 election has found that one of the driving forces was working class white racial resentment that is affiliated with, in some way, this sense of a loss of whites' position in American society. So I see this as a divisive story, and of course it's divisive in its very nature because it says that society is made up of these two great blocks, one of which is whites, and the white part is shrinking and the other part is growing. So I don't think it's a healthy way. I think it's an incorrect way, but it's also an unhealthy way to view the kinds of social changes that are taking place in the U.S. today.
And the incorrect part about it is simply that there is something happening that is really, I guess maybe it sounds a little bit, it's a little bit trite, but it's really sort of becoming a little bit more melty pot.
Yes, a little melty.
Than being sort of a binary question. I think there was at one point you spoke about data that showed second generation immigrants, if I remember correctly, had sort of outperformed, and then third generation immigrants had suddenly the progress had stopped, and it was
that's a little confusing, isn't it?
It wasn't a question of the progress or had stopped. It was a question of how people began to identify themselves.
Oh, that's true. So one of the things that's happening, so this has been a big issue in the study of Latinos, especially Mexican Americans. And so the argument has been that Latino progress stalls in the third generation. But what a lot of research has shown, here I'll bring in the University of Texas economist Steve Trejo and his colleague Brian Duncan, and they've done a lot of research that shows that at least a part of this story is that some Mexican Americans in the third generation are no longer thinking of themselves as somehow, or they don't really, that's not so important to them anymore. They don't identify themselves on census data in that way necessarily. And these tend to be better educated. This goes along, by the way, with a lot of research now from Pew and from others showing that over the generations, Latino identities fade. And Latinos, they're not denying that they're Latinos necessarily, but they tend to identify themselves more as American than as Latino American.
Which is what happens with immigrants in general, or the children of all immigrants in general, as they're
I agree.
less connected from. It's interesting that I feel like maybe some of the research that you looked at, they don't seem to take that into account. It's more just based on is this your last name? Is this your skin color? Is this how we classify you, I guess?
Right. That's right, actually. And so again, this speaks to the problem in treating demography as destiny is that you have to view these categories that we put people into as kind of fixed identities that don't change and aren't fluid. And that's really contrary to what's going on for a lot of people.
I mean, this just reinforces the notion that in many respects, and certainly at least in the context of certain cohorts of people, that race or ethnic ethnicity is wholly constructed, and it can be constructed differently by different perspectives, right? I mean, the census can have one perspective on what an ethnicity is, and the individuals who the census purports to be counting may have a different perspective on what their identity is.
Well, almost certainly that's true. I mean, the census data, we have to accept, are a limited kind of set of lenses for looking at our population in this respect. And I think they're particularly weak on capturing change. And, part of it is that they fit people into mutually exclusive boxes. So you can be mixed race, but you can't be these boxes don't reflect how important are the whites to this mixing, for example. So the decline in the white population in 2020 is actually partly a function of census methodological changes. So the census correctly decided that it wasn't doing a good job of identifying mixed race people. So it changed its classification principles for 2020. And in 2020, for the first time, under white and black, you could write in ethnic labels. And it scrutinized these ethnic labels, and it reclassified people as mixed when they used a label that belonged to another racial category. So, for example, we know from past research that a lot of people who come from Asian white backgrounds often on the census identify themselves as white only. And so now, they're encouraged to write in labels. And so they might write in, this is Irish, German, Korean. And so the census, Korean, you're also Asian, therefore you're mixed race. So it moved people out of the solely white category into the mixed race category. And as a consequence, it appeared there was an exaggeration of whatever white decline might have occurred was really exaggerated in census data because of this. So the census defines people as white on a very narrow basis. You have to be non-Hispanic and solely white by race. And that's the group that fell. But if you say, okay, let's look at people who are partly white as well as only white, those groups increased in numbers, though not dramatically. I mean, just very slightly, but they didn't fall. The big story of the first fall in the white population since 1790 actually hinges on a very narrow definition of whiteness.
So had the census used the 2010 definition of whiteness, do we have a sense of what that story would have been if
we can't say exactly because of the limits of the data that have been released, but I'm sure that the decline, if any, would have been very small.
Okay. And so, largely what we're looking about in this story is, there's sort of that's the story of, or at least one of the stories of the 2020 census, is that we're looking, some of what has come out of that in terms of a story is more a function of just reclassification.
Correct.
Than it is actual changes in demographics, if you will.
So it looked like the mixed population exploded, but that's because the census deliberately did a better job of measuring the mixed population. Of course, obviously, from my perspective, that is an important group, and it is growing, but not quite in the way that the census described.
So, as far as like what this perspective on what's happening with our demographics, that there's more fluidity in the way that people perceive their identities, and fluidity in terms of the way they identify within the categories that are presented to them, but also all the things that we glean from that, or social sciences glean from that,
yes.
Right? I mean, that's where things start to break down with the emerging democratic majority thinking, or the idea of demography as destiny thinking, and where we are today is that this stuff is a far more fluid, and they're not really the utility of these classifications as proxies for something else,
yes,
are just simply not as effective as we have assumed.
I think, well, that's a good way to put it. And I would say this, that, I think that if we would tell ourselves a different narrative about current social change and what it implies about the future, not the majority minority, but something that is more comprehensible in terms of the American past of assimilation, that the reaction would not be, among many whites, would not be as nationalistic as it is to the majority-minority story. We have very good research on this too, done by Morris Levy and Dal Myers of USC, and they've tested different narratives in social psychological experiments to see how people respond to them. And the response to the mainstream is changing and people are mixing more is very different from the response to whites are destined to become a minority in a couple of decades. So I'm not saying this is the solution to all our political problems by any means, but I do think it's important to correct the story because it's at least a tile, in a mosaic that could bring us to a better place.
And it's also important to correct the story because the story's wrong.
And that's why no disagreement on that point.
Right. I mean, so what? I mean, to the extent that we can get. I mean, can we get a handle on this, or is it? I mean, is there? If you apply your lens essentially to this type of data, where you understand that. And you were to try and capture this demography to the extent that you can. Can it function as a proxy, or is it basically telling us that we need another set of proxies? That class is more effective?
Well, I think, I'm certainly not going to dispute the importance of inequality. I mean, that's an inequality that isn't simply aligned with racial origin is really, really important in our society, for sure. And I think it's also, as you implied earlier with your statement about as long as, we have an underclass of subordinates, we're okay. Inequality is impeding the kind of social mobility that leads to more integration of people of disparate origins at the top of American society. So we certainly want to address that, as well as to address, the tremendous forces in our society, such as wealth inequality, that are holding African Americans back.
So you address some of the social policies to expand assimilation. I know you just have a couple of minutes here, but could you elaborate on those just a little bit?
Well, I think there are three fundamental dimensions. One is the economic inequality, which is much higher today than it was in the middle of the 20th century when we had our last great episode of expansion of the mainstream. And, and the other is the racial inequality that exists between lighter skinned and darker skinned Americans, to put it very broadly. But we know from the study of African Americans that that has a lot of different mechanisms involved that we could address. And one of the big ones is wealth inequality. And we understand how government policy over the 20th century prevented African Americans from accumulating wealth to the same extent that white families were able to accumulate wealth through home ownership, for instance. And of course, the other part of the African American problem is the coercive or the oppressive forces of the criminal justice system. And I talk about it in the book. I'm not an expert, but obviously, something needs to be done. And then finally, I think with immigrants, we have to understand that the legal distinctions among the foreign-born people residing in our country today don't have a parallel in our past. We didn't have any kind of sizable undocumented population, before really the 1960s, and we need to remedy this, which it's really a wound in our democracy, that so many people are, in the shadows of illegality, even young people who have grown up here and really no other society but the United States are sometimes in these shadows.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.